Executives at Google made the decision to fire an engineer who wrote a memo questioning women in tech. Now, I take issue with the way that this story has been reported in the news. And I highly recommend that everyone actually read the memo that has been controversial, because you might have a different perspective than what the media is telling you. But I do have the relevant portions of that memo for you, and then we'll have a discussion as to whether or not he should have been fired. Now, the engineer is James Damore. There he is. And again, he is the one who put out this memo internally and then got fired as a result. The memo did go viral, and it specifically had to do with diversifying the workplace and trying to be more inclusive of women in tech. Now, the memo, called Google's ideological echo chamber, relied on certain gender stereotypes, like the notion that women are less interested in high-stress jobs because they are more anxious or suffer from more anxiety, to rationalize the gender gap in the tech industry. So, look, that is, I'm gonna keep it real. There is research indicating that women on average suffer from anxiety more than men do, and it's because of hormonal differences. I consider myself someone who's in favor of equality. I consider myself someone who believes in diversity in the workplace. But I don't believe that that is necessarily a stereotype, because there is scientific evidence to back that up. However, we'll have a debate about this in just a second. Let me give you more information about what he wrote. So he wrote that openness directed toward feelings and aesthetics rather than ideas. Women generally also have a stronger interest in people rather than things relative to men. So he lists the differences between men and women. And he does say throughout the memo, look, these are not, these are generalizations. So it's not to say that every woman is like this, but generally speaking, here are the differences between men and women, and it's playing a role in the gender gap in the tech industry. So later on in his memo, he describes what could be done to kind of mitigate the differences, so you can be more inclusive of women. But again, he says that women are more interested in the aesthetics and being people pleasers. That, I think, is a stereotype, but we'll continue. He says that women are different from men in that they believe in extroversion expressed as gregariousness rather than assertiveness, also higher agreeableness.
Look, so we're actually going to the worst parts there, because I think all that is a crock of crap, okay? I think that's the worst part of his memo. I agree with you that the memo is more interesting than people are letting on.
Yeah, because here's the thing. Look, the media I don't want the media telling me what I should think about it. I wanted to read the original memo, and I read it with an open mind, and I wanted to see where he was coming from. The way the media is reporting it, it makes it seem like it's just this memo insulting women and treating them as if they're genetically inferior or biologically inferior to men. In reality, what he's doing, look, there are generalizations in there that I disagree with. However, what he's trying to do is show that there are differences between men and women. And if we want to be more inclusive of women in the workplace, well then here are certain things that we could consider. So it wasn't this memo where he's like, women suck, man. I don't want women in the tech industry. And that's the way the media is reporting it, and it's just, I think it's unfair.
Well, so I'm more mixed on it than you are. So Let me first talk about the positives. So look, he talks about left-wing bias, but he also talks about right-wing bias. And he's not an unsophisticated thinker, right? So it's not a knucklehead online being like, oh man, men have it so bad. Just non-intellectual arguments that are stereotypes, etc. Right? And he sometimes cites stats. It's like men, by the way, suffer 93% of the work-related deaths. So they are picking jobs that are in some ways certainly different than women. Well, that's an interesting point, and that's a stat. And you could interpret it in different ways, but you don't fire someone for citing a stat. And he says things like feminism has made great progress in freeing women from the female gender role, but men are still very much tied to the male gender role. If we as a society allow men to be more feminine, then the gender gap will shrink. So that's a really interesting point.
Right.
Here's another interesting point near the end in one of his footnotes. Men are expected to be strong, to not complain and deal with problems on their own. Men's problems are more often seen as personal failings rather than victimhood due to our gendered idea of agency. This discourages men from bringing attention to their issues. Perfectly fine point, okay?
Yeah.
So it's an interesting memo in those regards. But I think that when he gets into the so-called biological differences between men and women, that's where I think he totally goes off the rails. So now, it's one thing to cite the stat about work-related deaths. That's a perfectly fine stat and makes sense. And it's an interesting conversation to have around that stat. Well, and are men choosing certain jobs, women choosing certain jobs? And Anna and I have discussed a million times on the show that 77 cents on the dollar that women make per men is not about the same job.
Exactly.
There's a ton of factors in there, and you have to look at it holistically. But when he starts getting into women likes things and guys like ideas, that's not backed up by overwhelming research. You can't generalize like that based on weak sauce. There's one study I kind of think said that. That is not a conclusion you can reach.
Let me jump in, because the thing is, you're right, he makes good points in there that I think should have led to a discussion within the company as opposed to Google freaking out and then immediately firing him because they got a little bit of criticism, right? However, I do agree with you that there were generalizations there that are not backed up by evidence. There were points made about the differences between men and women that are backed up by evidence, the anxiety point being one of them. But look, here's one thing that I completely disagree with, right? So his argument is, well, men are just more assertive than women, which is why they're more likely to get paid more, they're more likely to get hired for these positions. And look, that is not a biological difference between men and women. That is a social conditioning issue. Because when a woman is assertive, when a woman is strong, when a woman is aggressive, the way society treats her is very different from the way society treats a man who's just as aggressive or just as assertive. And so we need to understand, that is an issue as well. And by the way, I'm not denying at all that there is an issue with sexism in the tech industry. I actually experienced it firsthand when I moderated a panel at a conference called Collision in New Orleans. I had to moderate a panel with two Silicon Valley CEOs, and they were horrendous to me on stage, would not let me speak, insulted me in front of a crowd of people, and I could not believe the way that they treated me there. So I'm not gonna deny that there is an issue, but what I want is a dialogue. And unfortunately, when you immediately fire him and don't have that dialogue, I don't think that that leads to real progress.
So look, don't get me wrong, he is not a moderate. He's definitely on the conservative end of the spectrum. He calls himself a classic liberal, which means he's really conservative. Okay, that's like an excuse people use. And he says things like, the same compassion for those seen as weak creates political correctness. Okay, well, number one, that's total nonsense. And number two, he's in essence there saying women are perceived to be weak and need to be protected. Hence, we do all these diversity programs for them, et cetera. And all it is political correctness. Now, or it could be that they have been historically disadvantaged. Now, that is context, and it should be something discussed and debated as to how to address that. So for example, why did we do civil rights and affirmative action in the first place? Because whites had almost all the jobs. And understandably, they would want to give it to their kids. So you're a longshoreman, you want to give it to your kid. Now, in order to do that, you can't let blacks have that job because you're going to give it to your white kid. So you could say, oh, now I can't give it to my white kid, you're discriminating against me. No, we were discriminating against blacks and not letting him in that job in the first place. So it's a matter of how you frame the issue, and you could say, oh, that's just political correctness. And you're just being weak by giving into it. No, there was obvious historic discrimination, and there have been against women as well. So I don't agree with his framing. And it's interesting, he also asked for a safe space. He says that this creates a, quote, psychologically unsafe environment, end quote, for men. So, okay, that's fascinating. Again, I'm not saying the guy's a monster. But if I'm the boss, I gotta say, hey, listen, you wanted to start a conversation about the disparities and that could lead to a different pay scale, and have a conversation around what jobs women seek. That's an interesting intellectual debate, and I'm not gonna fire you over that, even if it's against our company policies and et cetera, right? But when you say, imply that women are weak, and Anna, there's a tiny bit of research on the anxiety thing. It is not conclusive, so I don't agree with you that. And the way he framed it is even worse. He says neuroticism in describing women. Higher anxiety, lower stress tolerance. So now what have you done? You've now, if we say that's an okay thing to say, now at a meeting, when a woman says something and we haven't taken any action on this,
right?
Then, okay, are people wondering, oh, is it because she's neurotic? Is it because she's weak?
I get that.
Is it, or is she just being agreeable, right?
I know, but here's the thing. I think that unfortunately, the way that companies react to these types of memos or these types of comments, it ends up being counterproductive. Because I agree with you, there were things written there that I disagree with, but I'm much more interested in having a conversation about it than kicking them out of that conversation and then pretending like that type of ideology doesn't exist, right? Because it exists. And there are people working at Google right now who completely agreed with that memo, right? And so if they think that this problem is now gone because they fired him, they're absolutely wrong. And by the way, look, I looked into the anxiety thing because I don't want to accept it. I'm a woman. I don't want to accept that I'm going to suffer. I'm more likely to suffer anxiety compared to men. But it was not just some maybe random study. It was a study done by a researcher at the University of Cambridge. They found through their research that women are twice as likely to suffer from anxiety, and it's specifically because of hormonal differences. And so,
but it's just one study, and I'm not dismissing the study.
Right.
But you can't draw gigantic conclusions and then base your hiring decisions or argue that your hiring decisions should be based on just one study.
I agree with you on that. But again, that's why it's important to have a conversation.
I know, but look, so it's a little different. Now, I argued that Rush Limbaugh shouldn't be fired. When he said outrageous things. You remember Don Imus back in the day when the nappy-headed comment,
yes,
right?
I remember.
I argued he shouldn't be fired. I argued that exactly, bring him in. Let's have a conversation. Let's have a conversation on air, whether it's the right or the left. Al Sharpton, I've disagreed with him plenty. I don't think he should have been fired. Okay, but they're not doing talk shows, which is the whole point of a talk show, is to have those conversations. The whole point of media is to, I think, to have these discussions. College campuses, we agree that conservatives should come on college campuses. That's an area where you're open to having a conversation. This is it's a private work environment where it is super important to them to be able to attract top level talent who are both males and females. If you don't take action on this guy, now just think about it this way. Let's say it's not men and women, and he wrote the same exact memo, but about whites and blacks. And he said, oh, I have some evidence that blacks are more neurotic. Now, he didn't say that. So I'm not trying to have you hold that against him, okay? I'm just giving an analogy for what would you do in that circumstance. Blacks are weak, blacks are neurotic, blacks are this, blacks are that, okay? Now, the difference between men and women are more significant than the difference between races, so I'm not impugning it on him. But if he wrote that memo, you'd have to fire him.
Of course, yes.
Right?
Yes.
So
yes, okay. But there are differences between men and women, right? There are things that there are significant benefits that women have, and there are significant benefits that men have. So, for instance, when it comes to IQ, anyone who comes to you and says like men have higher IQs than women, no, okay. In terms of the G factor, general intelligence, I believe it's referred to. We're the same, okay? But there are differences. So when it comes to spatial reasoning, multiple studies have indicated that men are better with spatial reasoning, but there are other things that women are actually stronger than men on. And so, look, I think that we actually do a disservice when we pretend like, no, men and women are completely the same. We're completely the same. No, there are differences. We all have our strengths and weaknesses. And so if we're to have a genuine, sincere conversation about how to improve the workplace so there is equality, we need to keep those differences in mind. That's not to say that women are less than or men are less than, but again, we have strengths and weaknesses that we should celebrate. And we should talk about. And unfortunately, we don't talk about it, and I think it is a disservice, and that's the reason why companies like Google haven't solved their equality issue.
No, I look, so it's different situations. That conversation should be had here. It should be had on conservative talk shows. It should be had on, on TV and college campuses, et cetera. Okay, but Google is a private company, and they have an enormous number of women working there who now feel like they're going to be judged at every meeting if this is considered within the acceptable ideas, not because of politics, but because this guy is saying women are biologically not right for these jobs. And if you say, yeah, that's acceptable, that's totally fine. Now, what have you told those women? And even if you think that that is an okay idea, well, those women don't feel what you've done to 40% of your workforce or whatever it is, right?
Yes.
And let alone, by the way, if you're running a company, how about your clients, your customers? They're 50% women. And so you have to take those things into account.
Let me be absolutely clear. I do not agree that women are not fit for these jobs. So for anyone who might think that, I just want to make sure I clarify that, right?